William Wilberforce was grappling with this great question of how can I give my life to God? What can I do for the rest of my life that would please him, that would enable me to be the best possible instrument in his hand? It's the 1750s in England, and religion is on the retreat. The culture is becoming more and more morally corrupt. There are all kinds of things happening, orphans not being cared for, children not being educated, young prostitutes roaming the streets because they have no other way to provide for themselves, all kinds of social ills. And a man is born named William Wilberforce to a very wealthy family with relatives who are some of the most powerful and wealthy in England. He's a very attractive man. He's very charismatic. He's very likable. He's a really good guy, a really nice guy. And he has cousins that he goes to visit at one point who are Methodists, who've been converted to Methodism. And for a time, he becomes very passionate about this new faith. But his parents let him know that he's basically going to be cut off if he decides to go with this newfound faith. He's young, he abandons it, he goes on his way and continues to just make the round in his circles of high English society until eventually, through a series of events, he is reconverted fully to Methodism and to Christianity. He says at this point that the scriptures were plain and could not be gainsaid on this most basic point, that all was his wealth, his talents, his time. All that was his wealth, his talents, his time, was not really his. It all belongs to God and has been given to him to use for God's purposes and according to God's will. So he goes through a period of struggle and depression, trying to decide how God would have him live his life, what he ought to do now as a man in his prime, who is completely devoted to his faith, who wants to act out his faith in some concrete way and doesn't really know how. He has power in Parliament. He has very powerful friends. His best friend is William Pitt. He has basically unlimited financial resources. He knows some of the most important in England, some of the most important people in England. And one of his cousins is a man named Thornton, who was, I think it's John Thornton, was arguably the wealthiest man in England, who also himself was a Methodist and who lived a few miles outside London in a little village called Clapham. Now, for how wealthy he was in today's money, it's estimated that he died with 45 million pounds, but he gave so much away all his life and really was kind of the instigator of the work that would later become Wilberforce's and the work of what is now known as the Clapham Circle or the Clapham sect, because they lived in Clapham, England. And one of the first things that John Thornton did was start a little, I can't remember what it's called, but an organization for orphaned boys to be able to be placed in the Navy and gain skills so that they could provide for themselves. And it was hugely successful. He printed Bibles, he educated the poor, did several good works in his time. And Wilberforce grew close to him. And for a long period of time, William Wilberforce was grappling with this great question of how can I give my life to God? What can I do for the rest of my life that would please him, that would enable me to be the best possible instrument in his hand? And he said, God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade, and the reformation of manners. So basically, what he said was that he had had a great spiritual encounter with God, and that God had given him two great mandates to work towards in his lifetime, that both were essentially in and of themselves akin to basically moving a mountain. I mean, each of them individually would have been virtually impossible to accomplish for a lot of people in a lot of lifetimes, let alone one man in one lifetime. And he said that God had laid both on his shoulders. What he meant by the reformation of manners was these problems in English society. At this time, it's hard for us to imagine how different people saw things then. And it was not at all fashionable for Christians to do good works. It's not because Christ didn't say those things he did, and it's not because the Catholic Church and other churches didn't try to do good things they did. But, in our world today, if someone calls themselves a Christian just by virtue of calling yourself that, the other person, whoever you tell that you're a Christian to, they immediately associate a whole bunch of obligations with that. They lay upon you, the culture lays upon the person who claims to be a Christian, a myriad of duties and responsibilities that weren't necessarily so closely associated with that, at the time of Wilberforce, almost, 300 years ago. And the reformation of manners meant that he basically wanted to overturn the culture. He said, we need to change the way that we're treating each other. Those that have more have an obligation to those that have less. And we need to take that responsibility seriously. I want to read you a story about, before I do that, let me give you a sense of, I've got a couple other books with me. The book review officially is on Amazing Grace by Eric Metaxas, a truly life-changing book for me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why in just a minute. I've got a couple other books with me that I'll tell you what they are, but basically the introduction of this book gives you a background, a little bit understanding of just how dramatic this shift was that Wilberforce and this small group of individuals was able to bring about. The current popular beliefs, these are the current popular beliefs that we have today. Like I was talking about with when someone calls themselves a Christian, what do we think that they are or should be or should do? They originated in sincere Christian principles by devout believers who gave all that they had to infuse these beliefs into the minds of humankind. They voluntarily took responsibility for certain ills of society upon their own shoulders and showed the way to what it means, what they believed it meant to truly be a Christian. And here's some things that they reformed. The concept of the eternal soul and the need to care for each other as brothers and sisters because our souls are eternal. The equality of all people, the immorality of slavery, the right to education as a religious right to know and learn of God, the dignity of the individual to be treated humanely under all conditions, and our responsibility for the underprivileged. So this is the great, what did he say? The great objects, the two great objects that God Almighty has set before him to bring about. And he draws to his cousins, his relatives. He begins to brainstorm what this could mean. He starts out most aggressively against the slave trade and does a myriad of things, a myriad of great works. In fact, The issues of child labor and factory conditions, the problems of orphans and widows, of prisoners and the sick, all suddenly had champions and people who wanted to help those less fortunate than themselves. At the center of these social ventures was the Clapham Circle, an informal but influential community of like-minded souls outside London who plotted good deeds together, and Wilberforce himself was at the center of Clapham. At one point, Wilberforce was officially linked with 69 groups dedicated to social reform of one kind or another. In fact, I took some notes in the back of my book. The Clapham Circle and Wilberforce are known to have been involved with over 250 charitable organizations. These are some of the good works that they did. Taking care of homeless children in London. Of course, the abolition of the slave trade, which has its own deep history that I won't get into. You just need to read the book. Prison reforms. They helped make Freetown happen in Sierra Leone. They supported Haiti. They spread Christianity. They were involved with mental hospitals, cruelty to animals, prostitution, orphans, and a myriad of other good works. They printed, I think the count for John Thornton on his death was 45,000 Bibles, and given out all over the world. And so the list goes on in the kinds of things that they were accomplishing. And I have this one story I want to read to you really quickly from Amazing Grace. And by the way, Eric Metaxas is an incredibly engaging author. I think he's probably most popular for Bonhoeffer, but maybe he isn't. Maybe this is his most popular, but engaging to read, entertaining, funny, well-researched, very clear, but he does a lot of character development for you and helps you understand. But it's also super helpful because he helps you understand what were the key elements that led to the eventual complete abolition of the slave trade, and then when the British committed what turned out to be 30 million pounds to in taxes that were laid on the British people to eradicate slavery. So unbelievable that they were able to plant in the public mind over a period of, I guess, 40 years. On his deathbed, 3 days before he died, Wilberforce was given word that he had realized his two great objects and that the slave trade had been overturned. So this is a really sweet story. It will just give you a taste of what the book is like and a little window into Wilberforce's character, because I've got to say that one of the things that really hit me when I read this book was just how, of course, I spent all these years in public school and all these years in university, and it was one of many instances in my adult life where I felt robbed of some of the richest information from history. What happened in Great Britain at this time with this group of people is so radical. The vibrations of it are felt. I mean, there are so many people in the West now, wealthy people and famous people who have no association with religion or spirituality or God at all, who still believe that it's morally incumbent on us to give to the poor and to take care of the underprivileged in real concrete ways, is a direct result of the work that was done here. And I just felt kind of cheated that I had never really been given this really gold nugget of history. And I really believe there are so many other really fascinating, important, impactful things that we could know and learn. Anyway, that's totally beside the point. One of the many reasons and plugs for why we need to be lifelong learners, but this book touched me so deeply, so many times. And this is just one small anecdote of how rich an experience it was. Wilberforce traveled with his sister Sally to Cowslip Cowslip Green to visit Hannah More and her sisters. Hannah's sister Martha, knowing Wilberforce loved natural scenery, this is kind of in the middle of Wilberforce's fight. He would exhaust himself physically, and just so you know, he did give everything. He lost his health and his wealth. He died basically broke because he had literally given everything he could to these two great causes. Like he didn't leave any stone unturned, I guess you could say. He just gave it all. And so this is one of those times when he has exhausted himself in the cause, and he is pushing himself hard, and this is kind of a reprieve, meant to be a little bit of a breather, get his health back under a little bit better control. And so he's traveled here, and they know that he loves the natural scenery, so she insisted that he take a trip to the nearby Cheddar Gorge, which afforded some of the finest scenery in England. So he's supposed to kind of be on vacation and be taking a break. So, Cheddar Gorge is the largest gorge in the United Kingdom and the site of many caves. But during his visit, Wilberforce was less moved by the scenery than by the inhabitants of the area, whose poverty was extreme. And to Wilberforce, shocking. They had no school at all, nor any church. Some of the miserable souls did not even live in hovels, but scratched out an existence in the caves themselves. On his return to the Moores' home, Wilberforce was clearly of a mind to be alone with his thoughts on what he had just witnessed. He retired to his room to pray, did not touch his food, and later emerged with a clear purpose. "Miss Hannah More," he said, "something must be done for Cheddar." They discussed various schemes until the hour grew late. At last Wilberforce declared, "If you will be at the trouble, I will be at the expense." And he meant it. Whatever they would do to help the poor there, he would fund it. Wilberforce insisted that Hannah not be shy in asking for his money. To do so, he said, would only be pride disguised as false humility. Over his lifetime, Wilberforce gave away more money than we can imagine, and he now wrote the first of many generous checks to launch the Moores' work among the poor of that area. Hannah More soon started the first schools in the area, and Wilberforce would continue to fund them for many years. That's just the kind of man he was. Those are just exactly the kinds of things that he would do. Those are the grand, broad, generous thoughts of a great man, bent on doing as much good as he humanly could because he cared about each and every person he came across and tried to always find a way to be of benefit to them. I loved this quote from the book. He knew if he discovered a truth to his satisfaction, he would have no choice but to embrace it and to act upon it. And of course, for what I do and the concept of the truth making us free, it is absolutely the case that he freed so many in so many literal and spiritual ways, mental freedom and physical freedom. It's just unbelievable the good that he and his group did. In Wilberforce's day, it was devout Christians almost exclusively who were concerned with helping the poor, bringing them education, and acting as their advocates who labored to end the slave trade among all these other evils. So I fell in love with this book and with these people and with this time period and with this story to such a degree that I went on to get other books about the Clapham sect, and here's two that I was able to purchase: The Clapham Sect by Stephen Tompkins and Saints in Politics by Ernst Marshall Howes. It says, The story of the Clapham sect is one of very public achievements reaching across continents and far beyond their own lifetimes. But it is also a family saga. These were people for whom family and friendship were of the utmost importance. They lived in each other's spare rooms, married each other's brothers and sisters, prayed together, worked together, dreamed and schemed together, consoled each other, and criticized each other with ruthless honesty. And all of this was their faith. Their overriding concern was to serve God. It goes on to mention what I've mentioned before. Their greatest and most celebrated achievement was the abolition of the slave trade, then slavery itself throughout the British Empire and beyond. They were the founders of the British colony of Sierra Leone, of schools, of Christian missions, some of which continue today. They were members of parliament and used their influence to promote causes from prison reform to the protection of Sunday, from peace to censorship. And they achieved the moral transformation of Britain. And so just to show you just how much this meant to me and how much I care about it, in the Mission Driven Mom organization that I founded in our MDM Academy, we walk women through the 7 Laws of Life mission. And they are on a journey to learn to love God, to love themselves, to love truth, to love humanity, to hear the call to courageously execute, and to do it again. Those are the 7 Laws of Life mission that are outlined in my book, The Mission Driven Life. And when they're done with that journey, they complete a mission project and graduate. And upon graduation, they have the opportunity to step onto what I have named the Clapham Leadership Team. After this group of men and women who gave their all, gave their lives to make the world a better place, in their collaborations, in their mutual sacrifices, they did whatever they could to leave the world a better place. And so this is actually the mansion in which they met is called Battersea Rise, and this is the library. And you can see here 3 arched bookcases on the back of the room. And opposite of those were 3 arched windows that matched those bookcases. And then, of course, there's bookcases on each side. This is an older image. And we had a logo made for our Clapham team with these arched windows from the Battersea Rise Library, where these men and women met to do these great works. And women on this couch in front collaborating and doing what they can to also live mission-driven lives, as William Wilberforce did and as the Clapham sect or the Clapham circle did as well. So clearly this has had a profound impact on my life, on the work that I do in a myriad of places, on these are great heroes. These men and women are heroes of mine. I aspire to be a little bit like them, just like the Ten Booms and other men and women that I talk about so often. I want to end with this beautiful quote from Eric Metaxas, talking about a time when there had been a change in the parliament and it looked like they were opening their minds and there was going to be some opportunity to push this legislation again around the slave trade. And William Wilberforce got busy again, went to his writing desk like he so often did, and wrote countless letters to a myriad of people in order to try to bring about reform. And Eric Metaxas says, with his faith and the nib of his pen, moving mountains. And we can truly say that William Wilberforce was a man among men and a great individual who really did move mountains and radically transformed the culture and sent messages down to the current day about what it means to live an upright life, to be a good person, and to truly be a Christian.